Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Liz Deepers from Advocacy. Advocacy believes that every child and young person is entitled to a good life and the opportunity to thrive, and we're proud to support this roundtable and the Act for Children campaign. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. We'll have time for Q&A, and we encourage you to pose your questions and submit these via the chat box. The session is being recorded and we will circulate the link via email as well as on the Advocacy YouTube channel. It's my pleasure to now introduce to you Anne Hollonds, our National Commissioner for Children.
Thanks so much, Liz, and thanks so much to Advocacy for all your support for this roundtable. A warm welcome to everyone joining, and I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining from, the Camaragal people, and I pay my respect to all First Nations people joining the webinar today from across the country. I'd also like to welcome everyone participating from around the world. We've got quite a lot of international interest in this webinar, so welcome to all of you as well. My name is Anne Hollonds, and as Australia's National Children's Commissioner, my role is about making sure our laws, policies and systems protect the human rights of all children in Australia. This roundtable is the third of a series in the Act for Children campaign. Act for Children is a broad coalition of organisations and individuals across sectors calling for legislative and policy changes and to make child safety and wellbeing a national priority in Australia, building on decades of available evidence and on the human rights of children as articulated in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. At our first roundtable, we heard from the Commissioner for Children and Young People in England, who was visiting here at the time. She talked about her role and the powers under the UK Children Act. At our second roundtable, we heard from two human rights legal academics, Professors John Tobin and Claire Fenton Glynn, about the potential for a National Act for Children in Australia and also a Cabinet Minister for Children in Australia. The recordings for these are available on the Australian Human Rights Commission website, on the National Children's Commissioner pages. And if you'd like information about the Act for Children campaign, at this stage you can do it by reaching out to me through the email address kids@humanrights.gov.au, which Liz has put in the chat. So today, without further ado, I'm privileged to introduce you to the wonderful Bruce Adamson, former Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland from 2017 to 2023. During this time and working directly with children, Bruce and his team helped to change laws on the age of criminal responsibility, the physical punishment of children, and the incorporation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law. Bruce's term as chair of the European Network of Ombudsmen for Children was during the very challenging period of the COVID pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Bruce is going to share with us a bit about the journey in Scotland, and then we will go to your questions, some submitted earlier and also as invited in the chat. We only have an hour today, so my apologies in advance if we don't get to your question. And now it's my great pleasure to simply hand over to Bruce, who has been a wonderful support to me and to so many advocates for children around the world. Bruce has had to get up very early to be with us. It's now 6 a.m. in Scotland. Thank you so much, Bruce, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and for such a warm welcome. It's a stormy and dark Scotland here, but I'm sure that the sun is shining where you are. It's a real pleasure to be amongst such incredible children's rights advocates from across Australia and across the world, and it's a really important time. I want to tell you a little bit about what's been happening in Scotland, but this really is a roundtable, so I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and hearing your questions and learning from you. For those of you that aren't familiar, Scotland's a country of 5.5 million people. It's on the opposite side of the world in the northwest of Europe, and we have around 1 million children. Scotland formed the United Kingdom with England 300 years ago, but it's always maintained a separate legal system. And that's really important, particularly since over the last 25 years, we've had our own parliament. And so the way in which children's rights has evolved in Scotland is very, very different to that in England. And you heard some of you from the English Children's Commissioner in the first roundtable, as Anne has said. I had the huge pleasure of being the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland between 2017 and 2023. It was the best job in the world. I got to travel all around Scotland, hearing what was happening in the lives of children and young people and working alongside them to make change on some really fundamental issues. Scotland's also the home of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. For those of you that are Harry Potter fans, I want to be very clear that all of the abuses that took place in those books and movies happened before my term, and everything is much better there now. Scotland, like Australia, often talks about wanting to be the best place in best place in the world for children to grow up. But Scotland often falls short. When I became Children's Commissioner in 2017, we still allowed the physical punishment of children. We had an age of criminal responsibility that was well below the international minimum of 14. We still imprisoned children, and we denied older children access to our welfare-based children's hearing system. And we still hadn't yet incorporated UNCRC into our domestic law. And as one of our political leaders has said, you can't lead from the back. And I want to really acknowledge the political leadership that we've seen in Scotland over recent years on human rights issues. There's a wide array of international laws which set out the human rights of children and young people, but I strongly believe that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is special. It's the first legally binding international instrument that brings together that full range of civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights, as well as aspects of humanitarian and environmental law for everyone up to the age of 18. Built on this premise that children should grow up in a family environment of happiness, love, and understanding, and building on the Charter of the UN, which speaks about the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, and really breathing life into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which proclaimed childhood as a time of special care and assistance. Children don't have the same political power as adults. They don't have the same economic power to influence and lobby or to access our systems of redress, which are difficult for them to access. So it's therefore incumbent on all of those of us in power to work and make special effort to ensure that their rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. And children often tell us how frustratingly slow political, legislative, and social change can be, particularly in a world where technology is changing so rapidly. And I think this is really important when we recognize some of the different challenges that children are facing, issues around climate change, technological innovation, and the fragility that we've seen through things like COVID and the current conflicts. And children have been showing incredible leadership as human rights defenders, especially on some of these issues like climate change. A few years ago, on the 30th anniversary of the UNCRC, we asked children to describe why rights were important to them using just 7 words. It's quite a difficult task. I ask you all to challenge yourself to do it at some stage. But they came up with things like, my rights give me freedom, power, courage. This idea that children can be empowered by their rights. My rights are my armor to me, demonstrating the protective elements of rights. And rights are help before you even ask, speaking to that positive obligation which rights place on the state. So I invite you during this conversation to reflect back on those statements, on rights being help before you even ask, what can we do to proactively support children's rights? My rights are my armor to me. Have we got in place proper protections within our law for children? And rights give me power, freedom, and courage. How are we involving children and empowering them as part of decision making? Because one of the really important things the Committee on the Rights of the Child has said is that for rights to have effective meaning, effective remedies must be available to redress violations. And so I do want to focus on those legislative changes which were mentioned in the introduction. So the comprehensive protection of children from violence, the law against physical punishments, the raising the age of criminal responsibility, prohibiting the imprisonment of children and young people in Scotland, and the incorporation of UNCRC. just going to take a few minutes to explain some of those things, and then I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So equal protection, as it was framed here, protecting children from physical punishment. It's very clear that assaults for the purpose of punishment should never be lawful, and there's no such thing as a reasonable level of violence. Legalized violence against children in one context risks tolerance of violence against children generally. And the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and the European Union have repeatedly called on Scotland and the rest of the UK to honour its international human rights commitments to protect children from assault. And the European Court of Human Rights progressively condemned corporal punishment in a series of judgments against the UK since the 1970s. It's a great source of shame that all of the leading cases on corporal punishment, the assault of children, at the European Court of Human Rights came against the UK, from judicial birching in the 1970s, from corporal punishment in state schools in the 1980s, corporal punishment in independent schools in the 1990s, and then in late 1990s, the issue of parental assault of children. And the court's been very, very clear that this is not acceptable. And the political leadership of Europe's done the same thing. The Council of Europe and the European Union, both very clear. The rights framework is fairly obvious to you all. Article 19 requires all measures to be put in place to protect children from physical or mental violence, and Article 37 requires children to be protected from inhumane and degrading treatments. And so the Committee on the Rights of the Child's been very clear, but other UN committees have been clear as well. In Scotland, it took us a long time to achieve this change. The start of the campaign was 2004, but it took us until 2020 to achieve this protection. And one of the key things from that campaign was a piece of evidence that was commissioned back in 2015, which looked at the impacts of children and young people. And the fact that Ireland had already changed was hugely influential for us as well, as was the leadership of an opposition member of parliament who was a former police officer, John Finney, who'd used physical punishment on his own children, and then as a member of parliament had learned about the impact on children of physical punishment and led our campaign. And that campaign was done alongside parents. It was done alongside psychologists. It really got our groundswell of public opinion, recognizing that it was no longer acceptable for us to have in law the ability to assault children. And I'm really pleased that was successful and brought Scotland into line with pretty much the rest of Europe and a growing number of countries around the world to protect children comprehensively from physical punishment. I'm aware I'm taking more time than I intended to, so I'm going to try and go a little bit quicker. But please start to think about what questions you'd like to ask as well. In relation to child justice, Scotland's got a unique system of youth justice and care and protection, which was developed in the 1960s, which means that we have a children's hearing system. I was a tribunal member, a judge within the system for 13 years, and I think it's a very strong model, because what it does is it addresses both children in need of care and protection and those in conflict with the law. But even though we've had that since the 1960s, not all was rosy in Scotland. The long-term longitudinal study of youth justice and crime carried out in University of Edinburgh, starting in 1998, offers a huge amount of information on children and young people, and it painted a very bleak picture, particularly in relation to the connections between socioeconomic circumstances and parenting interventions, school exclusions, and criminal interventions. And so it showed very clearly that the reaction of the state to behaviour of children was different depending on who you were and what community that you lived in. And until fairly recently, Scotland was the only country in Europe, and one of very few in the world, where we used the criminal law to address the behaviour of children as young as 8. I'm a former prosecutor in New Zealand, and I also sat on the children's panel here in Scotland for 13 years, and so I've dealt with many thousands of children in conflict with the law. And I'm very clear that the use of the criminal law on children is the worst possible way to address their harmful behaviour. And the Committee on the Rights of the Child, in their General Comment 24, stressed the need for a higher age of criminal responsibility of at least 14, but preferably 15 or 16, in order to comply with Article 40 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And wherever possible, we shouldn't be resorting to judicial proceedings and legal measures to address harmful behaviour by children. And this is really clear. It's also the same view taken by the Council of Europe and other international bodies that the use of the criminal law is the worst possible way of addressing the behaviour of children and young people. Again, we had a campaign that dealt very clearly on the evidence. We looked at the international outcomes of those countries with higher ages of criminal responsibilities, which showed better outcome, not just for the individual children, but also for society more generally in terms of reoffending and further harm, and very clearly argued for a higher age of criminal responsibility. We had interventions from the now chair of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, Anne Skelton, who's an expert in this, and also the former commissioner from the Commissioner for Human Rights from the Council of Europe, who both made very strong submissions to our government and parliament about the rights breaches that were taking place and the need to raise the age of criminal responsibility. However, our parliament was only willing to raise the age from 8 to 12. We were very, very clear that 12 should never have been a target and that it is not good enough. It still leaves us 2 years below the international minimum. And I'm very aware of these discussions being very live in Australia, particularly in the Northern Territories. And I think that this is something that we need to see clear political leadership on to ensure that we're taking an evidence-based decision and a rights-based decision for children and young people. I'm really looking forward to talking about the evidence that's really clear about how children end up in conflict with the law, how the state deals with different children differently depending on who you are and where you're from, and the outcomes of that criminal intervention and criminal route by the state versus a welfare approach. And that's very strongly linked to the third issue that I wanted to speak about, which is the detention of children. Because until a few weeks ago, we detained children within our justice system, within our prison system. And this was hugely concerning. While the numbers had dropped significantly over recent years, the impact of children being in the prison system was severe. And our prisons inspector did some fantastic work around this alongside academics and civil society organizations in my former office on the impact of children of imprisonment in the justice system, on their mental health, on the likelihood that they would go on to further harmful behavior, and even in a number of cases, the loss of life. And this death by suicide of 3 children over the last decade is absolutely unforgivable, that we're putting children into this situation. And so it's a shame that it took us so long to get children out of the prison system. And I know we have some questions around this, but we passed a law earlier in the year, and it came into effect very recently, that removed all children from our prison system. And children who are in need of a secure setting to keep themselves or others safe are done so through our welfare-based secure units, not our justice-based young offenders institutes. And we also extended the children's hearing system to include all children. Previously, 16 and 17-year-olds were sometimes excluded from that system. I'm aware I've gone over the time I'd originally intended to use, but I tend to rabbit on a wee bit. I wouldn't be very good at the 7-word stories that the children were great at. But I'm also going to touch on incorporation before we move to questions, because this is the thing I'm most proud of. And the timing is fantastic because it's exactly 100 years from the first International Declaration on the Rights of the Child, the Geneva Declaration, which recognized that hungry children should be fed and sick children should receive relief. and healthcare, and in times of distress, children should be prioritized. And it was a time of global uncertainty with conflict and economic instability deeply affecting children. And in response to that, we as a global community agreed to prioritize children. And then 100 years later, it took us some time. On the 16th of July 2014, Scotland took this major step forward in incorporating the Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law. It's one of the most important things that you can do to ensure that rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. And what it does is say that all public authorities must act compatibly with UNCRC, and that children and young people have the right to go to court to directly enforce their UNCRC rights. It gives the courts power to strike down existing legislation for being incompatible and issue incompatibility declaratives in relation to legislation of the Scottish Parliament. It puts obligation on the Scottish Parliament to pass rights-compliant legislation, and legislation must be read in a way that's compatible with UNCRC if possible. But it also puts in place requirements in the government to produce a children's rights scheme, which must be reviewed, and puts in place things like children's rights budgeting, children's rights impact assessments, and other tools to allow us to ensure that children's rights are properly implemented. The chair of the UN committee recently described it as one of the best pieces of children's rights legislation in the world, and I'm hugely, hugely proud of it. But some of the things we might want to discuss in the discussion we'll move on to now is how do we make that a priority? What evidence did we use? The decision to focus just on UNCRC and not the broader human rights framework, how we convinced the government to see it as a priority and secured the unanimous support of the Scottish Parliament, because that's something I'm hugely proud of, that this was unanimously supported, even by parties that historically haven't been strong supporters of human rights, that we're able to secure full and direct incorporation. We didn't try and rewrite the convention. We brought it in its entirety into Scotland, and we've already started to see an impact of that, because fully and directly incorporating UNCRC is the most important legislative thing that you can do. And I know, Anne, you'll be getting nervous because we do need to move to questions. So maybe I'll just stop there and we can come back to some other stuff during the questions. But what I would invite everyone to do when you formulate your questions is to think about those 7-word stories from the children. My rights being my armor to me, rights being helped before you even ask. Because I'm very aware that we don't have any children and young people with us, and usually as commissioner I would have had one of my young advisors beside me giving this presentation, but I'm no longer commissioner, a point that I'm still grieving, and it's also 6 a.m, so that would have been a bit cruel to ask children to join us. So I'll pass back to you, Anne.
Thanks so much, Bruce. And of course, I've had the privilege of seeing you on stage with young people, and you know, I know that they're there in spirit with you all the time anyway. Look, it's hard to know where to start. It's just been such an extraordinary series of achievements that you've outlined, and of course, we talk a lot about Scotland these days in Australia. Scotland's become very famous. Even that recent decision to pull kids out of prisons, it wasn't covered hugely or widely in the media, but I've met with members of Parliament who have mentioned it to me. So somehow the word has got around, and so we are very much looking to what's been done in your country. And I know that some of the early questions and some coming through now really go to, well, how did you get there? So rather than unpicking the bits, kind of if you could take a high level perspective and, you know, from where you started to where things ended up, and obviously still continuing. It sounds like you had some members of Parliament who were champions for children, but perhaps you could say a little bit more about how you got there.
Yeah. And I think the first thing to do is acknowledge the strong leadership of children and young people in Scotland on all of these issues, and the fantastic civil society organisations that we've got, particularly the Children's Rights Alliance for Scotland, which is called Together, and they were really strong partners here. So I think that's one of the huge advantages that we had, and I know that you have in Australia, is the voice of children and young people, and children and young people who are increasingly knowing about their rights and acting as human rights defenders, and there was a big program of work the UN did that I was hugely proud to be involved with, where Child Rights Connect produced an implementation handbook on child human rights defenders, and this growing recognition of children as human rights defenders was really key. And the reason I start with that is because it's the most important thing, but also as a strategy and as a tool throughout. We found that actually having children and young people sitting with decision makers, explaining the impact on their lives of the decisions that were being made was one of the most powerful things that we could do. It's very easy to ignore me, but it's very difficult to ignore a child who has direct experience and whose life will be directly impacted by decisions. And so that was really key, that children and young people and their voices were at the heart of it. The strong academic support that we had as well. We drew on the incredible research of Scottish academics, but also international academics as well, and that all of our work was really strongly evidence-based. And this was really important, particularly on issues around age of criminal responsibility and physical punishment, and also the impact of detention on children, that we were able to draw on really strong international evidence. And so particularly the global study on children deprived of their liberty, kind of massive global piece of work that's been done, which showed very clearly the impacts of criminalization of children and particularly of loss of liberty. And that was really powerful as well. And then really broad coalitions. And so with things like age of criminal responsibility, the police were a key partner for us, working alongside the police and getting them to say, actually, the use of the criminal law in this way isn't useful to us, and we're able to deal with these issues through welfare-based systems. Working closely with social workers and other professions was really key as well. And then that political leadership was a really important point as well, that Scotland wants to be seen as a country that's a global leader on children's rights. And so we were really asking politicians to turn that rhetoric into real change, and we're really challenging them. And I was seen as very critical, I must say, is that if you had one of our members of government on, they would say that I was probably overly critical and I didn't spend enough time praising them, and I spent too much time asking them to do more. But that was important to me as well, is that we really needed them to step up. And the last point, I suppose, that importance of getting, where possible, broad support from across Parliament. And so for our incorporation legislation, as I said before, we had the support of every single party across Parliament. We got them to put it into party manifestos, and throughout the process we were working across Parliament as well, because for foundational legislation like incorporation, you need that broad support.
So one of the early questions we got was about, how much of it was what you might describe as public advocacy, perhaps reaching out to the getting public momentum on this, using the media and so on, versus sitting down with, members of Parliament, perhaps the commissioners of police or whatever. How much of it was that sort of private room, closed room advocacy? Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, obviously it's a balance of both and lots of different approaches, and also I think it's about people working to their strengths. And so a lot of the private advocacy, that kind of sitting in the kind of the quiet spaces where you can have free and frank conversations. We got children involved in a lot of that. We created a lot of spaces where we brought decision makers to children, but kind of kept it out of the media, and kept some of that private advocacy, but very strongly made sure that decision makers heard from children and young people themselves and heard that evidence. Mine tended to be a lot more public. I had the huge privilege of being the Children's Commissioner. It is the best job in the world. But one of the things about the job is that you have these strong legal powers and these strong protections as well. As a Children's Commissioner, I had a protected budget. I was protected from removal from office. I was protected from various legal actions. And so I very much saw it as my role as being the one who was doing the public challenge. And so I spent a lot of my time in the media and in Parliament, before committees, and being very publicly holding the government to account. And that was important because it allowed civil society to kind of be the good cop a little bit more and do some of that quiet advocacy with government. So we intentionally positioned me as being the bad cop. But it's the wrong terminology to use after I've just praised Police Scotland. But I was very much seen as the one that was holding government to account in a strong way, and civil society was able to do some of that softer stuff. But it was a real combination of private and public.
And just on the civil society role, would it be fair to say that there was a strong, if you like, a rights-mindedness amongst civil society in Scotland already, or did you have to build that? Because I have to say, you know, in Australia, there isn't perhaps a very strong handle on what children's rights even means. It doesn't roll off the tongue, I often say. Yeah. In Australia, it's we're a little bit behind that way. But did you have to build that with the civil society organisations, or was that partly there already?
I think that was strongly there already over the last 20 or so years, I would say. And again, while I was Children's Commissioner from 2017, I had the privilege of working for the first Children's Commissioner back in 2003. And the changes over the last 20 years in Scotland have been significant, and particularly the last decade since the Children's Rights Alliance properly kind of formalised. They've gone from strength to strength. That's important in that there's a really strong core of children's rights organisations. I wouldn't say that plays out to the general public. We've still got a long way to go in broader children's rights education. But there has been some really steady progress over the last 20 or so years. UNICEF's done some good work, as others have, within our schools with their Rights Respecting Schools programs. So we're starting to build slowly a level of awareness, but it certainly wasn't something children's rights weren't regularly spoken about in Parliament a decade ago, and it started to become more of a thing. I think the media work that we did was really important, getting alongside the media, and those of you that are familiar with the British media will know that we have a lot of tabloids which take some quite extreme positions. It can be a very hostile place, particularly our print media. And we did a lot of work with newspaper editors and others, getting alongside them to frame things as children's rights issues. And I think in poverty, this was something I'm really proud of, is that historically poverty was the tabloids in particular would use poverty as a weapon against communities and shame people for poverty and speak about individual choices. And we did a lot of work to help them reframe that as saying child poverty is a political choice and a government failure, and actually getting beside the communities and working with them and with us to hold government to account. And I think that was probably the biggest shift, was some of the media narrative. We've still got a very long way to go, and the media is still very hostile at times. But there's been a significant change, particularly on issues like poverty.
Well, it's interesting. Again, I think we're a little bit behind you in that journey. It's only the second National Children's Commissioner, this role. But still, you're saying that about 10 years ago, you didn't necessarily have that coalition in place, but you managed that sort of built over that time so that then everyone was behind incorporation. I mean, that is such a massive, massive achievement. It's just seems so out of reach for us, but we're trying to bring it closer through this campaign itself, Act for Children, where we're really trying to shine a light on the value that it would have to have a National Act for Children as an accountability mechanism in legislation, which we have nothing of that at this stage. Now, I'm going to go to a question that I know there'll be a lot of interest in, is on that issue of taking kids out of youth detention and placing them in more welfare-based therapeutic units. Would you say a little bit more about how that was done, and a little bit about where these children are now being held, under what conditions, and who's responsible for their well-being?
Absolutely. I'll just reflect quickly on the last point that you made first, though, if you don't mind, in that just to give you a real kind of clear understanding of the time frame. In 2014, our government said that incorporation was not possible and not desirable. That was just in 2014. So 10 years ago, that was where we were. And even in 2017, when I became the commissioner, the government was against incorporation. So it did take us quite some time to work towards a position where we had the unanimous support of Parliament. And it really was by working away on that kind of strong evidence base as to why it would work. But you can definitely get there. I mean, our government was so hostile to it; they said it was impossible to do and not desirable. And even in 2017, they were against it. So it's that change can come a lot more quickly than you expect. Built on the backs of huge amounts of work over long periods of time. And that would be the same thing I would say about detention of children. Again, these are children some of whom have committed quite significant harm to others. And there's huge community concern about how their behavior might affect others, and generally who have been through the adult criminal justice system and been sentenced. One of the things that's really clear is that despite what the media would have you believe, at a global level, children in conflict with the law has been steadily dropping over recent years, at a global level, and particularly in Scotland. And the number of children in our Young Offenders Institute has dropped significantly from many hundreds into the dozens over recent years. So there was already a significant downward trend, both of harmful behaviour by children warranting criminal response, and of the detention of children within the justice system. But there'd been really long campaigns around the detention of children within the justice system, very strong evidence-based campaigns about the impact on their mental health. And again, as I say, that we've had a number of deaths by suicide of children, so under 18s, in our Young Offenders Institutes, which was hugely concerning. Another key issue that we were concerned about and raised repeatedly was the number of children that were on remand, because actually the majority of children in detention were actually there on remand, having not been convicted of any crime. But I think what one of the big catalysts, and so the government's response to this was actually, if this is going down over time anyway, and if we've really only got a small number of children in detention, is it a big issue? And our response to that was absolutely yes, because the outcomes for these children and for society are significantly worse. And what the big catalyst, though, I think was probably COVID, in that when COVID happened and we were all going through this horrific time, but the impact on children in detention was the most extreme. And it was really clear that we had children who were really being denied many of their rights through COVID, and we're able to engage the Parliamentary Justice Committee on this issue as to why those children were still in our Young Offenders Institute. And so that was a real catalyst. We were able to demonstrate the massive impact of children being in cells for very long periods of time, and this criminal justice approach, and that really galvanized the support of the Parliament, as did the unforgivable and avoidable deaths by suicide that we had, which really galvanized political and public opinion around questioning why these children needed to be in the justice system detention. And where they've moved to is welfare-based detention. So within our children's hearing system, which deals with care and protection and conflict with the law, there is the ability to detain children within secure residential settings, which are run primarily by local authorities, and some are run privately, but on a welfare-based system, not a criminal justice punishment system. So you're only in a secure unit so long as you are a risk to yourself or others. You're not there generally on a sentence. Although those that are sentenced in the criminal justice system are now and can go into that system as well. And so there'll be things that most of you will be very familiar with. So they'll generally have a community set within the community. They'll have residential units, and then they'll have some secure spaces that allow for children to be kept safe, but with full access to education, healthcare, and other things as well. And so the key point about it is that it's a welfare-based system, not run by the prison service.
So it's not run by the justice system, it's run by the equivalent, the child welfare department or whatever it's called. And
Yep.
do the children go out to the local school, or do they get schooling inside the secure facility?
Can be either. Generally it's inside the facility. And again, with no disrespect whatsoever to our community-based schooling, often because that's better. The secure units can often deliver really good tailored educational support, and the feedback that we get from children in secure is that actually the education in secure is actually really works for them. One of the problems we often have is actually transition out of secure, because some of the community-based education supports aren't as good as they need to be. But there's individualized plans for each child, and so some, particularly within residential, will go into community kind of mainstream schools, but most work within the residential schools. Okay,
thank you for explaining that. I know there's lots more we could discuss about how you're doing child justice now, but I might just flip to the prevention end for a minute. Perhaps we haven't really touched on that much, but I know that we have listening to this webinar representatives from education and from health departments in some states. So there's quite a lot of interest from I call those the early warning or upstream systems that really should be working better to prevent children ending up doing crime. Can you say a little bit about prevention of crime by children in Scotland?
Yeah, and we know that the best possible way to prevent harmful behaviour by children is to give them the support that they need, and to get the support into communities. We know the strong link between poverty and mental health, and the state's response to behaviour by children through criminalising them. And so that's one of the things that Police Scotland's been really clear on, and we had a fantastic piece of work done in Glasgow, where there was a huge concern around knife crime and gang culture, and the Violence Reduction Unit set up by Police Scotland really worked with communities. And one of the things that John Carnacan, who is a big Glasgow policeman, he's someone with huge credibility, but he in the early days said very clearly, we don't need more police officers. We need more social workers, we need more youth workers, we need more health visitors. The way to reduce crime, particularly violent behaviour by children, is to invest heavily on the support that they need. And we know that children that end up in conflict with the law have generally had significant adverse childhood experience, that generally in communities where there's issues around kind of poverty, addiction, additional significant health needs, and so getting those early supports in is the best way we can ensure that children don't end up in a situation where they're expressing their frustration and confusion with the world in harmful ways. And so we know, even from the police arguing that we shouldn't have more police officers and more youth workers, that's been something that's become a real mantra for us. And the evidence is really clear from the longitudinal study, the Edinburgh study that I mentioned earlier, that the more criminal justice intervention you have, the worse the outcome. Even if it's really well-designed criminal justice intervention, it's the worst possible thing that you can do. But actually getting those supports in relation to really good kind of health visitors, focusing on the early years, supporting parents around good early education, getting youth workers into communities, creating things for children to do and engage them is absolutely key. And it also, if you take a rights-based budgeting approach, it makes economic sense. So even if you weren't convinced by all of the massive global evidence that we have that this works, or the fact that it's a rights obligation to do this, to use all available resources to the maximum extent possible to address things like poverty and mental health. Even if you weren't convinced by that, the economic arguments are so strong that putting in place these early interventions deliver much better economic outcomes, because the cost of dealing with harmful behaviour by children through the criminal process, and the cost in the health system and the education system, in the justice system, is just ridiculously high compared with really powerful early intervention, which saves money and delivers better outcomes. And I think that's a really strong argument for politicians as well. And I often wish I was an economist rather than a lawyer when it comes to making some of these arguments.
So perhaps as a last question on child justice, because there's other things that you've mentioned that we'd like to follow up on as well. But I'm going to be the voice of the shock jock who interviews people like us. Do you have shock jocks in Scotland?
We do, and our tabloid media as well. So we as,
all right. So the shock jock would say, that's all very well, Commissioner. Of course, we want to get in early and prevent this. But what about the 11-year-old who's already knocking over grannies and stealing their purses and stealing cars? What do you do about that 11-year-old now?
Yeah, well, first of all, we recognise that that's a failure on our part, that 11-year-old got to that stage where they're seriously hurting others and themselves. And then we think about what's the best way to keep us all safe. So what's the best way to keep that granny safe? The best way to keep that granny safe is to get really good youth work around that child, get really good support into that child's family and community, and to address some of those underlying issues, and to take a welfare-based approach. And that might require that child to have some residential support, or even be in a secure place if they're so unsafe to themselves and the community, until they can get that support and help that'll allow them to express themselves in a different way and not harm other people and be safe in the community. But unless we take a welfare-based approach, a criminal justice approach is going to make the outcome worse. And that's if you're interested in keeping people safe, then a welfare-based approach is the best way to keep people safe. And I think talking to victims, one of the things that they're really concerned about is non-repetition, is they don't want the same thing to happen to them or anyone else again. And the evidence shows really clearly that the best way of doing that is a welfare-based approach, and that a criminal justice approach will make things worse.
So who were the biggest opponents then in Scotland? Was it the public sentiment? Was that the biggest challenge? Was it perhaps the shock jocks and the media that you had to bring round? I mean, who were the biggest challenges for you?
Well, I do think it was a failure of political leadership. I do. I made no bones about that. I was really, really disappointed in our government that whipped their members to vote against an amendment that we had that would have put the age of criminal responsibility at 14. And I think that shows both a lack of leadership, but also a lack of trust in the population to actually look at the evidence. I think that we actually were doing a lot better in terms of in the media and getting the message out there. And I think that actually some faith in people to look at the evidence and actually think about their communities and the best way of improving things. I think some political leadership was really missing there, because I think that this stuff isn't rocket science. This isn't that complicated to think actually what's the best way to address these things. It's also true that we know that as soon as you raise the age of criminal responsibility or change the law, the very next day a child of that age will do something of a really harmful behavior. And you have to address that by saying, well, we as a society have failed there. And this isn't the individual responsibility of some 11-year-old or 13-year-old. This is societal failure, and what's happened in our communities and our failure to support that child, and how can we make sure that doesn't happen in the future? And we need to take some responsibility for that rather than blaming a child.
Thanks. So I think there are some other things possibly that we should touch on in the remaining time. One of them being the corporal punishment change, because I have to say that whilst there is a movement now in Australia trying to get interest in this, trying to get interest in repealing century-old laws that allow parents the defence of reasonable chastisement, we're just trying to get those laws repealed. There isn't, I have to say, not a lot of political interest in this. It's very hard to get it on the agenda of anyone in power. Can you say a little bit more about how you achieved that?
Yeah, it was the same here, to be honest. And again, while Scotland and Wales have changed, England and Northern Ireland have not yet changed the law here. I think there's a couple of quick things. One is our government's position, I think, probably fairly similar to yours, was saying, actually, is this a big problem? We can deal with this through education, and the criminal law still allows for the prosecution of serious assaults. So why are we really concerned with these less serious assaults? And the physical punishment's kind of dropping anyway through education. Why do we really need to change the law? We're not really interested. And so that's why we went with an opposition member of parliament. So John Finney, who was a former police officer who'd used physical punishment on his own children and had then been convinced by the evidence. And so he really spearheaded this alongside children and young people, but also parenting organisations and social workers and health visitors. Were our real allies here, as well as the international evidence, because they were able to say, actually, this sends a really confusing message to parents. This is about clarification. This is about being really clear that we as a society do not accept violence in any setting, because we know the evidence that the psychological harm on children in terms of being told that violence is an answer to bad behaviour. But also we know that once you start to allow any level of violence, then that can lead to further escalation of violence. We're also greatly assisted by the fact that unlike New Zealand, which was one of the kind of early adopters in kind of comparative countries, Scotland is one of the last countries in Europe to do this. And Ireland, with its very, very strong constitutional protection for the rights of the family, was able to do this. So Ireland, which is often seen as a much more conservative country, had already made this change. And so we were able to get Irish politicians and senators over to say, look, come on, Scotland, this is embarrassing now that you're one of the last countries in Europe to do this. If we can do this, then surely you can. And so we actually embarrassed the government into doing it. We got the opposition party to sign up before the government did. And so the government kind of ended up being embarrassed into doing it more than anything else, I think. It wasn't huge leadership. It was very much opposition, and everyone saying it's about time we tidied this up. So even though we'd had decades of recommendations and general, including observations from UN committees and the EU and the Council of Europe, and everyone had said we needed to change, it was really more the campaign from the opposition saying this is a really simple thing, just get on and do it, that finally got the government on board. But it was opposition legislation, not government legislation.
Well, that's very interesting, but I can hear as you're describing it the value of having the EU, having that sort of the numbers in the EU to put pressure on a country. Unfortunately, I think in Australia we're so far away that we can say, well, we're special and different, and none of that applies to us. So we've got a few extra hurdles to climb there, and even what's happening in New Zealand doesn't really, play for us in Australia. It's also perhaps a bit of parochialism on our part, unfortunately.
Yep.
But go ahead.
And one of the great things that we had, and I think there was maybe a question around this, the devolved nature of the UK, where you've got England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Wales and Scotland play this to an advantage, and so Wales and Scotland were racing to see who would be first to pass the law on physical punishment, and that was actually a strong motivator as well. And so at your state and territory level, that was something where Scottish Parliament only just beat Wales to do it, and we were playing that up as well, is that if you don't hurry up, then Wales will be the first do it. So there can be some positives at the devolved level as well.
Well, that would be an advantage of our federation if we could get them sort of fighting that way rather than a race to the bottom. Now, we're very close to time, and I know we haven't covered every question, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. And I wanted to give you the last couple of minutes, Bruce, to ask you, you know a lot about Australia. I've whinged to you enough about the situation here, and you've known about Australia for a while. What advice would you have for us at this, a time, it's a pretty depressing time we've got right now, and people who are interested in the rights of children and improving the well-being of children, we're all feeling very burdened by things seeming to go backwards, not forwards, under our watch. What sort of advice might you have for us?
Oh, I'm not going to give you any advice. You're the experts, and I think I've always been hugely impressed and in awe of the incredible children's rights leadership that happens in Australia. Again, I've got John Tobin's book sitting behind me. You've got incredible academics there. The big fat one?
Is that the fat one?
In fact, I think I've got 2 copies there actually. But
it's very intimidating, that book, if John's online.
It's brilliant. But I think again, one of the things you've got incredible academics, you've got incredible civil society, you've got a strong network of children's commissioners, yourself but the others as well. And I think some of them are here. It's like you've got all of the ingredients there. And one of the 7-word stories that one of the children and young people had was be brave, stand tall, think big, believe. And I think that's the key part of being a human rights defender, being a children's rights defender, is tough. If it was easy, then politicians would do it themselves. We do have to be in these difficult spaces. We do have to work in communities. But I think that the progress that we've made in Scotland often came quicker than we thought, and it was kind of days of tiny triumph and weeks spent in despair. It was this stuff isn't easy, but you have to just keep working away at it. Take those opportunistic moments. If you see kind of the sun shining, then really use that. Move as quickly as possible. One of the things I was criticised for here was my relentless attack on government, and they were saying, actually, we're doing great things, give us time to do them. And I was very, very forceful in terms of, particularly with legislation. It's like, you have to pass this law now. And I talked about things like prevarication and delay. And I think there's a really clear example in Scotland where now the government has dropped its commitment to broader incorporation, that agreed to incorporate the other UN treaties as well. And now they've dropped that commitment because we're at a different phase in this government. And so kind of making hay while the sun shines is probably the key thing. Find those spaces where you can make progress and make progress as quickly as you can. Use the incredible skills that you've got and the expertise and the children and young people themselves. And there was a question in the chat that I'm going to reflect on, and this is this argument around children should be in school rather than out being human rights defenders. The fact that children have been sacrificing their own education to fight for things like climate justice, the fact that children have had to act as child human rights defenders is something that we should celebrate, but we should also ask why. They shouldn't have to be going out into the streets. But when children are choosing to act as human rights defenders, we need to be supporting them, making sure they've got the tools to do that, the education, the support and the protection. And I think that's really, really key, that children and young people are already providing this leadership, but it's our obligation to support them when they want to do that, and really for us to step up. And so I think find your allies within government, find your allies within the media, and just be unrelentingly positive about supporting children and young people and the huge benefits to society of a rights-based approach, and be unwavering in your holding government and those in power to account.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I'm just noticing in the chat, we have quite a few Tasmanians, I think, online. And I just want to say to the Tasmanians, absolutely acknowledge Tasmania could well be the first state to be the best place to grow up as a child. Someone put that in the chat. We're watching very closely what's happening in Tasmania, some great developments there, and all power to all of you from Tassie joining today. But thank you, Bruce. I I think, you know, reassuring that it's a hard battle, but that we should keep going and we should pull together across the sectors to continue the fight. And it feels like we're pushing uphill, but we are. This is a very important hill that we're climbing. And Scotland, as I said at the beginning, is a great inspiration to us. And you, having been the Commissioner for Children there over that amazing period of achievements, it's been such a privilege to hear from you this evening, our time, and this morning, your time. So thank you very much on behalf of everybody. We'll give you all a big clap. Thank you. And I'm going to wrap up now by thanking Advocacy again for supporting this roundtable. Thanks for all of you who have joined us this evening. Please look out for the next Act for Children roundtable still to be announced. If you have follow-up questions for Bruce, you can send them to me at kids@humanrights.gov.au. Bruce has kindly agreed to address those follow-up questions, and have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much.